Hello, I'm Colin Green, and you are listening to Spikepit, episode 74. Well, I've talked about it, I've promised it, and now it's finally here. Boardgame Brothers, episode 1, The Beginnings. This episode we're discussing the early influences on us in the hobby. Our early board games, The Hobbit, Dungeons and Dragons, and all that great nostalgic stuff.
My recollection of gaming is not as clear as it may have been some years ago, but if I can't cast my mind back, I think immediately of being 6 years old, having the Hobbit read to me in school, getting involved in rewriting bits of the Hobbit, making little sketched out drawings, etc. This is all down to a teacher in the past called Mrs. McConaughey. She was the one responsible for reading that Hobbit. What is your earliest memories, perhaps, of what could have been the inspiration for your interest in the hobby, although at the time you wouldn't have realised it was the hobby?
Well, I think you were obviously a couple of years ahead of me at school, so I think similar. I had the same teacher a couple of years later. We also read The Hobbit, but by that time I think you'd probably just about started getting into Dungeons and Dragons already. I pretty much joined in the Dungeons and Dragons at the same sort of time or in the same year at school that we were reading The Hobbit or having The Hobbit read to us. So it came in at about the same time, I believe. So yeah, I was pretty much started straight onto the Dungeons and Dragons role playing, really.
Now that would have been, by my calculation, we're talking 80, 81, and we started out, as regular listeners will be aware, we were playing Moldvay Basic, and that was what Mrs. McConaughey started us off on. And I distinctly remember our first adventure, which I talked about, where we were adventuring in a sort of nightmare version of our school. Do you recall that?
Yeah, we discussed this the other day, and I don't actually remember the adventure. I remember playing Dungeons and Dragons with her son and yourself at their house, and I do remember having to go to the toilet numerous times because of getting a bit excited and having too much to drink and being a little bit scared, I must admit, on some of the sessions. So that's my only real early memories of playing D&D.
It was definitely scary, and I remember that to actually go to the toilet in her house required a fairly extensive walk through the house in the dark upstairs. It was a business that was needed to be rushed to get back to the game and not kind of get waylaid by some sort of imaginary monsters en route.
Yeah, I remember the coming back down was a lot quicker than the going up with the lights on, because you had to turn the lights off at the top, I think.
Yeah.
So we used to come back down the stairs, back to the table, very eager, very quickly.
It was also gaming with our teacher that brought in Talisman. She had made a copy of Games Workshop's Talisman, the 1983 release. She'd kind of built a bootleg copy. Do you remember? It was a kind of photocopy cut and paste job.
Yeah, I've got some vague memories of a put together copy, as it were, but I strongly remember getting our own copy. I believe it was a Christmas present, and I think that was one of the earliest games that we really played as a family. Spent many hours playing Talisman when we was in our caravan. We used to go on our little caravan holidays, or Christmas was always a favourite time to get a new board game. So fond memories of Talisman, which went on for years and years. Many expansions, dungeon, the city, even the timescape or time lock space.
Yeah, I think for me the best expansion for Talisman was the adventure. Then it led into what became pretty bloated, and the setup time and the breakdown got all a bit too much. But I think as kids that didn't worry us so much. I think it's only when we revisited it in later years did the bloat seem to be an issue.
Yeah, there was too many components at the end, and the game was sort of stretched and it sort of broke down some of the core mechanics where you could get from the dungeon straight to the crown of command, which was like the centre of the board, all dependent on the luck of the dice obviously. But yeah, the whole sort of first game, or the main game, was all about slowly moving your way into the middle of the board and building up your character so you were strong enough to do it.
How much do you think the designer, Robert Harris, part of the Games Workshop team, how much do you think they drew on the success of, or what appeared to be the growing success of fantasy gaming and Dungeons and Dragons? How much do you think they drew on that for their Talisman release?
I think Dungeons and Dragons made a massive impact, and the whole role-playing scene brought that game into more people's homes, and it became more and more popular just because it was a bit like a board game version of role-playing.
It's got the ingredients, it's got a fairly rapid progression. You've got attributes that go up and down, you've got your wounds, magic items, monsters. You've kind of got a mission and an adventure, and the story kind of famously forks as you get onto the third tier, and you can go craft or strength route. So I thought that was good, and I think at the time we were talking about board gaming at Christmas, and we'd been playing the likes of Stratego and some of the MB games, Risk, stuff like that. And this was the first game where I thought I think we were getting our parents involved in what was our hobby. I think me being a couple of years older, maybe I felt that a little bit more because I was designing my own monsters and starting to run adventures and write dungeons and have birthday parties that were themed on D&D. So I was looking to get everything to have that D&D vibe, really.
Yeah, it was always hard to get a group for D&D. That's the problem with a lot of people for role playing, I should imagine, is getting people for a face-to-face group, because obviously there was only face-to-face groups back in that time. We were lucky we had friends at school that we managed to get into role playing, but like you said, with the board game you could have just family, friends, people that thought that role playing wasn't for them or thought it was weird or strange. They would happily sit down and roll a few dice and move a character around a board and play a board game, because it was similar to Monopoly or whatever board games, Cluedo, and what games they were used to playing. So it wasn't that big a difference to them.
So what you're talking about there is like the classic gateway or on-ramp concept. There are other games, and the first one that comes to mind for me is the classic Heroquest. Do you recall how that came to be? I got a feeling that was your game, weren't it?
I think that was one of my Christmas presents. Once again, we had the tradition of at least one Christmas present would be a board game every year.
Yeah.
At least one of us, or both of us. And I'm sure Heroquest was one of those. It had the classic Dungeon Master screen, so someone was setting up all the little items behind the screen with a little map. And again, you had your characters moving around, leveling up, but you could flow from one game to another. You'd move on as a little team, and the wizard would get new spells, and yeah, there was a definite, again, role-playing sort of feel to it, but obviously you were limited on the board because it was a set board.
That never really seemed to matter though. I never found that as all that limiting, and it did seem to kind of attract quite a few people. We got people involved with Heroquest that never played any of our role-playing games. That's a fact.
Yeah, again, we'd quite happily play it with mum and dad. They would take part. We would take it in turns. Generally, it was normally you or me that took the role of the dungeon master or the games master. Everyone loved it, I think.
What about the date? Can you recall? I'm a bit sketchy as where that came in our development, on the timeline.
I would say it was mid-80s.
Yeah.
I'm thinking 85, something like that. I would say it was around that time.
I think by that time I'd started making a foray into some other Games Workshop releases like Warhammer Fantasy Battle. The board gaming at this point probably tailed off for me a little bit, although I was still playing on family occasions. I think amongst my friends we were getting into miniatures games, and that could have been to do with Heroquest. I think it's possible that you got Heroquest as a Christmas present because you were maybe deemed as a bit too young for Warhammer. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how that came to be, but there were other Games Workshop games. You remember the Doctor Who? We played quite a lot.
Yeah, we had the Doctor Who boxed game, similar box to Talisman. Again, remember many times searching the galaxy, coming across the Cybermen, and I've managed to get K9. I remember K9 being one of the most useful allies that you could have on your team. Some strange cybermat creature that looked like a woodlice.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
And the thermal lance.
Yeah, the thermal lance was a really nasty weapon that you could get, and you were basically just travelling around looking for these strange keys with different sort of symbols on.
You had 3 things on each planet, didn't you? I think it was a grid with a planet in each grid with the name of the planet, if I recall, and you had like a blue counter, a red counter, a green counter and a purple counter, but I don't know if they were always present.
Now you had some blanks, so you could turn up at somewhere, get some great sort of magical artifact type thing and no monster whatsoever, and then the next planet across you could come across something that you would deem as pretty useless and come up against the Cybermen or Daleks or something that were really going to challenge you. So yeah, it was heavily luck based on that front, but it was always exciting to see what you turned over when you turned over those counters.
And it's not a title that gets talked about very often. I don't know if it made a splash in America or just didn't happen. Obviously it was a Games Workshop release before they were tied into exclusively Warhammer and 40k and all that. I think it had a lot of the elements that you'd find in a role play because it was kind of exploration, there was the equipment and the goodies, there was fighting the baddies, you almost had NPCs in the form of the assistants. So I think they definitely took some inspiration from, well, you know, the current RPG craze that was ongoing at the time. Games Workshop, they really had 2 main strands of game that they were putting out. They had stuff that drew from RPGs, and then they had stuff that drew more from some of the war game type things.
Well, they had the miniature games, didn't they? So they had board games that were more miniature based. The one I remember and still love to this day was Space Hulk. That was quite an early game once again, and I think it had a little resurgence recently where they did a sort of limited edition or a limited run of it, because you had the miniatures, you had the board that was randomly sort of laid out, or it came with a number of scenarios, so you laid out the map and you got your little squad in your team.
And you could draw parallels between the squad and what we know as the party. They were almost an adventuring party, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, in the Deathwing expansion, you brought in some new characters as well. So you had your grunts or your marines, which were your standard sort of fighters, I guess. You'd always have a commander or a leader who would lead the way. You'd have librarians, you'd have sort of heavy weapon guys, melee guys. So you'd have the different sort of classes more with the expansion. And it did add quite a bit to it, and you could build your team with sort of points, values and things. So it did expand on it quite a lot. But the thing I liked about it was the whole command points. So you had so many points per member of the team. So even turning, moving, shooting, they all had command point ratings, and you also got a random sort of team command point that you could spend on any of the team. Something I've always thought of when we talked about role-playing games is the whole, you can move or you can shoot. Why can't you spend your time not moving and shoot twice? Well, that's not how it works. With that game, you could do all your movement on all your command points just moving, or you could spend all your command points just shooting. You had options, and it was very simple how it was laid out. I always liked that system. You knew exactly where you stood, Something I thought role-playing games could maybe use time for actions, and you've got so much time and you decide which actions you want to do rather than just move, shoot, or shoot, move.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely RPG systems that use a different action economy, and I can't think offhand, but you've definitely got games out there where you could shoot twice if you didn't move. Fairly famously, D&D is not one of those. And the other thing about Space Hulk, of course, it's got that tension idea introduced with putting a timer, real time on the game.
Yeah, it came with a little egg timer, or at least a suggestion of a time limit. And they also built into the game mechanics that if you did lose your main man or your commander, your time limit would actually be reduced. So instead of having 90 seconds or 2 minutes, it may have been, it was reduced by 30 seconds if you lost your commander. So they sort of structured that into the game. If people were good enough at the game and liked the pressure of the good team, as it were, the Marines side, then they would limit you to time. Whereas the bad guys or the aliens, they didn't have that restriction.
You could work in a certain amount of role playing as well if you wanted to. You could ham it up, and there'd be people doing like bolt a gun sound effects and screechy alien noises when they come around the corner, and it's, you could definitely play it with a more role playing kind of vibe.
Yeah, I mean, you got the blip counters as well.
Oh yeah,
so you didn't know what you were coming up against until you had line of sight on the blip or the counter. So it could be anything from 0 to 3 aliens just hiding round the corner.
Wasn't there a sort of set of rules or guidelines for writing out your own missions and stuff, or did that come later, like fan produced?
I don't know if there was actually rules structuring it. They obviously promoted it, and when you got White Dwarfs and magazines like that, I think they produced extra sort of
they did
missions, and people wrote in with what they think would be good missions. And I used to write my own little backstory so I could read it out before the game started. So yeah, that was fun.
And if you wanted to just kill things and take their stuff type of game, it was a perfectly fine system for that. By the end of it, there was quite a bit of granularity with the options and the equipment fit outs and everything. You could go to town.
Yeah, it was simple just to have a counter base. So you said, this mission is going to have 40 counters, or it's going to be 50 aliens, or you can set limits on it. You could set turns, how many turns you've got to achieve something. You had exit points or entry points, so you could have to get from A to B, or you have to lock down the entry points where the aliens come through. It's something I've definitely thought about reintroducing to the group on a one-off basis, just for a bit of fun really, and I've got the 3D scenery for it now, so that would bring it to life a bit more as well.
We have played it in more recent years. I believe my eldest has played. I think Sonny would enjoy it. We probably should get it to the table and maybe do a short campaign. I tried the Stay Frosty rules, and the difficulty there was the lack of knowledge of tropes for the kids. It would be a lot more obvious if we was playing Space Hulk. The fact that it's 3D, you've got miniatures, I think a lot of that would be communicated through the props, as it were, rather than where I'm playing a space game, Theatre of the Mind. If the person is not really imagining the picture, you've got a problem.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's seen Alien or Aliens or any of those franchise films, as soon as you say you're walking along a spaceship, the lighting flickering and bits of steam coming out from vents and whatever else was going on, and so you get into it quite quickly. But like you say, if you haven't lived through that era and seen those films, and
if you're 9 and your dad won't let you, that's the problem there.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the miniatures and the layout and the map and the board and everything like that would bring it all into focus a bit more and make it easier to imagine and get into the game.
So what about Milton Bradley? They brought out Space Crusade, and my recollection of that was it weren't as strong, and it was very similar, and it had a little bit more variation on the enemies, because you had goblins and space orcs and things, but it was for the mass market. But I don't know what you think about that. It was a bit of a little bit lame, I thought.
Well, it was basically Heroquest in space. That was pretty much how it panned out.
Well, it followed on from Heroquest, didn't it? I think it was probably only a year or two after.
Yeah, like you say, it had the little goblins from sort of Warhammer 40k with their strange weapons. It famously had the sort of Ed 209 big machine that looked like
that
something
mech
out of Robocop. The mech, which was always a nasty thing to come up against. A number of groups failed after meeting that chap. But yeah, it didn't quite work for me. I don't know why.
You couldn't make up the board, could you? It was like HeroQuest. You had that set board and you sort of closed off rooms and just moved doors around and stuff, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it had doors and that, but it had a lot more open areas and wider corridors to get the Ed 209 character across the board, because it was so big it took up 4 squares. They had to make the corridors wider, the rooms bigger. We still enjoyed it, we still played it. I never purchased that one. I think one of my friends had it.
Did it work differently with the teams? I seem to recall, were you against each other? Was it more competitive or something like that?
Yeah, I think there was a competitive aspect to it. I think you had 2 or 3 players against the bad guys almost. So it was down to who could get the most points in kills of the bad guys.
It was a bit wonky. It was a bit wonky, that part of it.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't have the same memories as the HeroQuest did. But again, it was enjoyable. But it was, I think it was a sort of afterthought, and they were trying to just continue the success of HeroQuest really, because it went down so well, and it never really got to the same level, and I think it died out quite quickly. Or
looking at maybe bringing this to a close, they're the main runners for us in the early years, board game wise. Is there anything that we're forgetting, do you think?
I'm sure there was other games that we played, but most of those were what I would class as traditional board games.
Yeah, abstract strategies.
Yeah, this was more sort of had a slight role-playing theme, or miniature based, and that's where it started. There were other games, workshop board games, like battle cards and things that we played. Yeah, they were the main ones that give me that sort of role-playing feel, or had some sort of connection to role-playing in my eyes.
Because at this point, really, our interests split and went wargaming and role-playing separately, because I think we're getting into the time when I was maybe 11 or 12, setting a group of friends up to play D&D, and then separately another group of friends, I'm doing Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
And there it is, part 1 of our discussion. Got 3 parts to this, and the second part will follow up in the not too distant future. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. As ever, if you've got any comments, please feel free to call in, and if you've never called in before, I would encourage you to do so. It's really quite a lot of fun if you can overcome that initial shyness. Anyway, take care. I'll catch you later.